We're live, we'll call the meeting back to order, and we're on to 6.4. The good news, yeah, right.
Morning, Council. So I guess probably don't have quite as much of a robust discussion for you here today as what I had hoped to bring to you or what you might have been expecting. I know when we spoke last week about the budget, I told you I was going to take some of your feedback. I was going to put that into the more robust, fulsome operating budget presentation and return that to you today. Unfortunately, very shortly after that, identified an error in the draft budget that had been prepared, which caused a fairly significant shift in what I presented to you last week. And so what I've come to you today to present is another sort of shorter format of the operating budget, and requesting a little bit more feedback from you in order to take away and bring back that full budget presentation next week, ideally. So we'll get into it. So this is, it is essentially a good chunk of what you would have seen as the normal, like the full budget presentation last year, but a little more focused towards what I need feedback on today. So starting on page 3, I have that pie chart of our gross revenues and what percentage relates to each category. These numbers are overall very, very similar to what they would have been last year. There are 5 different categories that have changed slightly. So that would be the residential property taxes has come from 43% down to 42% this year. Services provided to other governments has gone up from 8% to 12%. That's primarily due to the other governments who partake in our services at the landfill. The other properties and other property taxes and grants in lieu has come from 10% last year to 9% this year. And both the deed transfer tax and sewer charges have dropped by 1% from the previous year. The next page is the similar chart showing the expenditure breakdown by percentage. Again, these numbers are all very, very similar to what they would have been in the previous year, with, in this case, 4 exceptions. So the transfers to reserves, last year would have been 13% of our total expenditures. This year we're going up to 16. Primarily that is due to the change in how we treat the deed transfer tax and the infrastructure development reserve. And that 3% is equally offset by 1% reductions in each of the salaries and benefits from 20 to 19. The capital purchases went from 5 to 4, and the grants to organizations has dropped from 2 to 1.
So
you didn't make any changes to that today, so that's still accurate. What I have built here was under the assumption of the growth in that, or basically assuming what you've decided today is that we're leaving it as is for now. All those, that's to say, all those grants you're looking at are included in this budget that you're seeing. On the next page, page 5, this is some highlights around assessed values around the 3 major categories of properties in the municipality. So under residential properties, of course, by far the biggest portion. And I should note that the assessed values mentioned in this section are the taxable assessed values. So that's the ones that apply, that have the cap applied, not the market assessments. So the total assessed value of residential properties in the municipality has gone up from just over 1.9 billion last year to just over 2.1 billion this year. That's a 10.9% increase in total assessed value of residential properties, which was a 12.3% increase in the previous year.
Do we know how much of that is new?
So you can see there's a bar chart just below this section here that shows it's breaking down by the rough change, or no, the change in assessed values. So you can see that the number of properties that were removed or had reduced assessments, the ones that had no change, and then all the way over at the right is the ones that are new.
Okay.
So I don't have the exact count here for you, but it is a very small portion.
Yeah.
You can see from that chart that the vast majority of residential properties are under that 3.2%. And the total of all the properties that had an increase of 3.2% or less is 79.7%. So nearly 80% of all residential properties are seeing assessed values increasing by 3.2% or less this year. So when you see an average increase of 10.9, that is entirely fed by new construction or properties that are not eligible for the cap. Okay. On the commercial.
Can I ask another question to clarify? So the average, including the 80% that have increased 3.2% or less is 10.9?
That's the total increase. So the average isn't quite exactly that because the number of properties changes, but it would be very close to that, yes.
So the 20% that are above 3.2, they're way, way above 3.2.
Yeah, well, not all of them, but yes, in general, that's where the vast majority of the gains are.
Because they were sold or whatever.
Sold or new, or somebody, improved a property, put a new facility on it, something like that.
Boy, that sounds fair, doesn't it?
There is a little bit of a breakdown on the next page of that we'll get into that shows kind of the contributions. So commercial properties across the municipality are up. The total assessed value is up to nearly 127 million from 112.8 last year. That's a 15.3% increase in total commercial assessed values. With the average assessed value of 307,000, which is an increase of about 10.2% from last year.
Do you have that broken down by district?
I have that information, but I don't have it right with me today.
Can you give us a chart last year with my district, and we can get an updated chart?
Yep. And then resource properties is kind of the third main property category in the municipality. However, it's significantly lower proportionately. So 57 million in assessed value compared to 52 million in the previous year. So that's an increase in total assessed value of 9.7%, with the average being an 8.5% increase. And for commercial and resource, obviously the cap does not apply to those properties. On the next page, this is basically taking that information on the assessed values and translating that into revenue numbers. For the sake of presenting this, we have assumed all rates being consistent with last year. We know that's a part of the discussion we were having last week and perhaps ongoing.
That's where it is at the moment.
But for the sake of preparing examples and comparisons, we've used the flat rate. So total residential property tax revenue budget as it's built right now is $14.6 million, which is up 10.9% from the previous year. The average tax bill for a residential property is about $1,541, which is an increase of $139 from the previous year. Yeah, the average tax bill on a capped property, or in this case I'm saying capped property, that's just all properties that saw an increase of 3.2% or less. Doesn't necessarily mean they're all capped, but it's a rough placeholder. The average bill for those properties is $1,280, which is up $30 from the previous year, so a 2.4% increase on the average tax bill for 80% of properties. You can see this bar graph here, which shows the average increase by each category of property. So the ones that had a reduction in tax, in assessed value, saw an average reduction of $419, they're $18 on their tax bill. The ones that are between 0 and 3.2% saw an increase of average $40 on their tax bill. And to Councillor Vino's point earlier, the properties with an assessed value increase of more than 50% saw an average increase on their bill of $1,290.
Wow.
Or would see, of course. Commercial properties, we're budgeting an increase in property tax revenue from just under 1.7 million last year to just above 1.9 this year. So that's a 12.5% increase on the commercial tax. With an average commercial tax bill of $4,607, which is a 7.3% increase over last year. There are 413 commercial properties within the municipality, and 20 of those properties make up half of the gain in revenue. So of those, 25 of them are organizations that receive a full exemption due to the bylaw 74. Another 7 were recreational and leisure facilities, and the remaining 8 were primarily industrial properties. The resource category, the total resource property tax revenue is $396,000, which is up 9.7% from the previous year. And the average tax bill for a resource property is $171, which is a 6.9% increase from last year. The next page is to discuss the uniform assessments. So the uniform assessment is something that is provided every year for every municipality. to give a standardized measure of assessed value for each municipality. It's used to calculate our provincial education amount contributions, as well as calculating our contribution to the PBSC funding. It does lag, so the timing of it is a year delayed from when we see our actual property assessments going up, and the actual property assessments are a year to actually kind of 2 years in delay of when the actual property value goes up. So for example, changes in market value up to the end of 2021, so as of January 1st, 2022, PBSC's opinion of that market value is used in the 2023 roll, so almost 2 years delayed. And then those changes don't get picked up in the uniform assessment until 24-25. So here in Nova Scotia and Chester, of course, 2020 and 2021 saw a pretty significant increase in property values, certainly higher than we were used to historically. Those increases did not hit the uniform assessed values until the 23-24 and 24-25 years. So the impact that we're seeing here, and this is where we get into that error that I identified, is that this wasn't calculated quite correctly the first time. The increase to this year's operating budget for the education amount is $697,000, 613.
That's the increase.
That's the increase in this year from the increase in assessed values, or the uniform assessment. Yeah. And that was after last year we saw a $467,000 increase in that. The total of that is, I don't have the exact number here in front of me, it's 6 million, actually I do, $6,472,000.
That's the total to pay for education.
Yeah.
6 million.
So that's a 12.1% increase over last year's contribution, and it is the single largest expense that we incur here.
Largest budget expenditure yet.
Yeah, the PBSC contribution is also going up, although that one isn't quite the same magnitude as the education amount, but there's a $42,000 increase in this year's operating budget due to that. I've included another graph here that just kind of shows that lag of timing. The grayish, bluish line is the total assessed value of all resource, residential, and commercial properties, and the red line is the uniform assessed values. So you can kind of see how every time the gray line moves somewhere, a year later the red line follows it. That's just an example of the delay and that impact.
Yeah.
So on to page 8, so some revenue highlights from the budget. So the deed transfer tax is budgeted at $2 million this year. That's down from last year's budget of $2.2 million. And this year we are budgeting currently for 100% allocation of that deed transfer tax to the Infrastructure Development Fund, which is up from the 50% we did in the previous year.
Yeah.
So what that means is that there is $0 from deed transfer tax going to the general operations this year, whereas last year there was $895,000 being contributed to general operations. Landfill fees are budgeted to go up to $5 million this year, which is up significantly from last year, primarily due to the way that we calculate the cost sharing revenues and in a particular low year last year. The solid waste area rate is budgeted to collect $2.7 million this year, which is up about $254,000 from last year. This is again based on assuming flat rates, so it's entirely based on increases in assessed value. The gas tax is budgeted at $619,000, which is up to $28,000 from last year. That one has no impact on tax rate because it is just moved over to reserve immediately. Sewer charges, we discussed this a bit last week, so we're budgeting for $1,137,000, which is up 4% from last year based on applying a CPI increase to the EDU, the equivalent domicile unit universal charge for sewer. And wind energy revenue is budgeted at $1,466,000, which is up about $13,000 from last year.
How much is in the infrastructure development fund now?
The infrastructure development fund, as of the end of the 23-24 year, is estimated right around $5 million.
Wow.
So on to page 9, the next one is focusing on the salary, wages, and benefits portion, which is 19% of our overall expenditures. That's $6,797,000, which is broken down as shown here on this slide. $251,000 for council remuneration and benefits, $155,000 for committees and casual employees, staff and salary wages of $5,315,000. And there is a detailed breakdown of that. However, it doesn't totally tie because the direction received last week to adjust the salary scales, there's about a $12,000 unallocated expense budgeted for right now. Overtime budget is unchanged from previous year. Employee benefits are $1,161,000, which is just a function of wages for the most part. And then there is a offsetting kind of a negative expense for a vacancy allowance to allow for movement in positions and turnover. We've used a 3% estimate this year, and we're estimating the year that just ended to have an actual of 7.8% vacancy, and the year before we had an actual of about 4.5%. Just to give a little more detail on the table down below here, you can see it's broken out by department and then total, and that's that so the bottom right, 5,302,000, that's actually the 5,315,000 from above, plus the 12,800 of unallocated. And so the salary review, that's the impact of the 2023 salary review being picked up into the budget. Step increases are people moving within the bands that they are employed at. The cost of living increase is based on that discussion we had last week.
Yeah.
And the other is primarily from positions that were approved mid-year and now are being allocated to a full year worth of budget. I know there was some of that in the community development and recreation department, so that's where you'll see the biggest piece there. Some other expenditure highlights. So we've talked about this already, the school board contribution, almost $6.5 million for this year. And that is calculated based on the uniform assessment that we've discussed. Transfers to the RCMP are just shy of $2.5 million, which is estimated 6% increase from this past year's actuals. That's a number that, again, we don't have much say over, or any say over, and we actually don't know what it'll be until after we've built our budget, so we just have to assume an increase there.
Yeah.
Insurance premiums, we're assuming another 20% increase there. They have been going up very rapidly year over year. So total insurance premiums budget for the year is budgeted at $356,000 and change. Transfers to reserves is another very significant expenditure that makes up 16% of this year's operating expenditure budget. So that's $5.6 million, which is up $1.75 million from last year. Now, primarily that is the general operating reserve, which is the solid waste contribution tied back to that increase in revenue for solid waste and services to other governments. And then another very significant increase there is that allocation of the deed transfer tax to the infrastructure development fund. And then there's some other changes. I've broken them all out here: the wind energy, gas tax, the IT equipment, parkland and sewer. Modest changes to each of those, nothing too significant there. The next page has, just a repetition of the information that Chad just presented to you. So unless anybody has any questions, I'm going to skip over that one. And then here's a breakdown of the transfers from reserves. So this would be revenues within the operating fund, funding those one-time projects that are not part of ongoing operations. So these are things that aren't going to affect the tax rate because they are being funded from reserve. There's some special projects budget. There's that standard contingency budget that we've been including the last bunch of years. Some community wells engineering costs, the potential for the summer water program for dry wells, some consulting budget.
We're going to need that anymore.
A good chunk for some scanning, document management, basically space concerns. So getting a consultant to help with that. And then the election this year will be primarily funded from reserves as we make a contribution to that reserve every year to offset the cost. So it's not a big lump in every fourth year, it's an equal expense each year. And then from the wind energy reserve, we've got the special projects, the capital grants through council for $75,000. And then some economic development activity, the arts, culture, and recreation strategy, the growth strategy, and some surveys and appraisals work at Wake Up Hill, as well as a small grant for fire training, which is kind of an annual The next page is a slightly more detailed breakdown of the transfers to reserves, so that a lot of this is repeating what I've kind of told you already. So the solid waste surplus is contributing to the operating reserve. The deed transfer tax is what's contributing to the infrastructure development fund. Gas tax reserve is just that revenue in, transfer out. IT equipment, parkland are very small amounts that we've discussed briefly. The wind energy reserve, we're budgeting for a contribution of $952,000, and that's a third that is allocated to each of the economic development, community development, and general. And that's made up from the net wind turbine operating revenue, so revenue less expenditures, of $241,000. And then the wind farm developer tax, which is in the property taxes and grants in lieu section, for $710,000. And then the sewer. Yeah, that's the South Canoe one, yeah. And the wind turbine is our own wind turbine, yeah. So the next page is really what I spent a lot of my time this last week putting together. Kind of trying to summarize the changes from year over year in the budget from both the revenue side and from the expenditure side. So at the top, you can see the net tax supported revenues, or tax revenues, of $16.5 million or so. Now this is our total revenue. So basically what I've done to get to these numbers is I've looked at all of these self-funded sections of our budget. So the solid waste, the wind turbine, the sewers, all of those are self-funded. They don't impact the general tax rates, and so they've been carved out so that we can just look at the general tax rate funded stuff. So that's your net of all taxes. It's about $16.5 million last year. The changes to our revenue are that change in deed transfer tax allocation of $895,000, and then an increase in assessed values, assuming rates stay the same, has increased our budget, or revenue budget, by $1.7 million. So that brings the total revenue change is an increase of $843,000, which brings the available tax revenue, assuming no change in rates, to $17,334. And then we go down to the expenditure side, which of course starts with the same number because it's a net zero budget, of course. The taxes are equal to the amount that we spend against the taxes. And then the high level changes to expenditure from year over year. So I've tried to break these out into sort of how much discretion council has over them. The top section is things that you really don't have a say on. The next one is things that you do sort of have a say on, but like, for example, are you really going to say we don't clear snow off the new sidewalks? And then the bottom ones are the ones where there's a little more discretion.
The Remo one's interesting.
Yes.
I'll just put it in there.
I didn't put any comments on that one because I figured you'd have your own to add.
Well, it is what it is at this moment, Tom.
Yeah, that's one of those ones where you do have discretion, but not necessarily as it impacts this year's budget, right? And so you can see there's two columns of numbers there for each of the categories. One is the 24-25 budget amount, and then the amount that has increased from the previous year, and then as a percentage of the increase as a percentage of this year's budget for that item. A couple items I'd make note. So obviously we talked about the education amount, the next, and the RCMP amount and PDSC. There are two negatives there in that first category, and that would be corrections and housing, and that is from the service exchange with the province. They have eliminated those costs to us, so those are savings against the budget. I've broken employee compensation into two categories here, because the top one here in the first section includes things like step increases, annualization of the budget, of part year growth from last year, and like turnover changes. And then in the green section, I've included the cost of living increases section. And I should note that this is just the tax supported portion. So it doesn't include landfill wages. It doesn't include sewer costs for people, that stuff. In the blue section, the sort of discretionary, but not really, increase in snow removal contracts, that Remo cost. The net increase to the finance department operating budget is pretty much entirely due to basically better allocation of interest income to reserves that they belong to, rather than having them flow through operations first, as well as an increase in audit fees that we're seeing. Insurance costs, we've talked briefly about that already. Again, it's something we could say, let's get less coverage, but that's, the amount of savings you find there for the amount of risk you have to take on, And then Public Works had an increase of $33,950, primarily due to fuel and vehicle repairs and maintenance costs. Then we get down into the green section with the cost of living increases. Tax-supported cost of living increases are budgeted at $177,000. The landfill host fee, we talked about that last week, about allocating that to general fund rather than just straight to the reserve. Council remuneration has increased by $40,000. Municipal properties, so primarily that increase is due to capital from revenue. I apologize, I don't have that capital budget right in front of me to tell you what item it is specifically that we're budgeting there. I'd have to go back and look. Council expenses have gone up $36,700, primarily for conferences and hospitality. That's, I think they were deflated during COVID when everything was shut down and they're starting to go back up again. And then everything else in the budget has been reduced by about $6,700. Now, of course, this is not a comprehensive list of every change in the budget. I basically started with the highest dollar values and picked through them until I went, well, everything else is below the lowest number you see here, and it all combines to a reduction in the budget of about $7,000. And you can see right at the bottom here, the total in yellow is $17,650,000, which does not agree to the yellow part above on the revenue. And the difference between those is the deficit currently in the operating budget of $316,000.
That's what we got fine.
If you were interested in the impact to the residential tax rate, I did include a column over on the right that shows what portion of the 69.5-cent tax rate that increase represents, just to give some context as to how it relates to each other. So essentially what I'm looking for today is, so the biggest changes that we've seen from year to year are the education amount, significant change, and the change in how we treat the detransfer tax. Those two alone make up more than the change that we're seeing in the budget and the shortfall. So there's an easy way and there's a more challenging way. The easy way would be to adjust that allocation of detransfer tax. Based on the way the budget's built now, you could change that 100 to 84% and it would clear that deficit. The more challenging way would be to say, no, we want you to go and do other things to close that deficit. And if that's the direction you'd like to give us today, we're going to need more time to go and do that exercise to prepare the information to come back to you and say, okay, here's what we found, here's the impact. And if you choose option one here today, we can next Wednesday come back with that full budget presentation based on everything we've taken in last week and this week, and be ready to go. If you choose option two, there's going to be more work required and we won't be ready to do that next week. If you are to choose option two, we would ask for some guidance. Say, are there certain things you absolutely don't want us to look at? Are there certain things you absolutely do want us to look at? That kind of thing. But it would take some time for administration to go back and build that package to come back to you with suggestions.
Hey, Tina?
Certainly, so I could scroll down up the slides, but there's about $5 million, did you say, in infrastructure development?
Yes, yeah, that's an estimate based on our Q3 forecast, but yeah, it's about $5 million.
So about $5 million right now in that reserve that we have, okay? And last year was 23, 24, because right now we're going into 24, 25.
Right.
So last year we put in 50%, and the hope was for 100. So yeah, I'm okay with
Well,
that.
and technically, I was looking at this morning, the motion at last year's budget was to allocate 50% plus any surplus, because there was a surplus we were dealing with in the budget last year.
Okay.
So that $5 million includes half of the detransfer tax, plus any projected surplus for the year from Q3.
The overall budget.
Right, yeah.
But the detransfer tax piece was at 50%.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and last year we were budgeting 2.2 million for detransfer. The actual looks like it'll be closer to 1.8. So it's about $900,000 contribution there.
Sitting on $5 million.
Andre first.
What do you think we're going to ask for?
I don't have any coins in my pocket to flip right now, but
Yeah, I'm interested because there's some big categories there. Everything else, for example,
yes.
there's a lot of stuff in there, and oftentimes it's like building a whatever, an apartment building or something like that. You make a great budget, but it's like thousands of little items that end up eroding away the costs, and then before you know it, you're in trouble. oftentimes I think these budgets are death by 1,000 cuts. I would be in favor of having a harder look. I realize it takes more time. So I guess that's where I'm at. I have another question though. It's a little more starry-eyed. When we allocate resources to the maintenance of our sewers, all of our public infrastructure, especially the ones that are user-specific. So I'm not on town sewer, Derek is.
Village sewer.
Yeah, things like that. How do we take those, like, employee hours and all that? Like, is it all captured somehow? How does that split out?
So the staff that work in public works, the ones who split their time between, say, municipal properties, mowing the lawn, and sewer work, dealing with whatever it is. I'm the finance guy, not the sewers guy. But we do allocate their costs to the function that they're working on. So there are some salary costs and other costs that are loaded to the sewer. Anything that goes against sewer expenses is not affecting tax rate, the general tax rate, because it goes from the universal sewer rate funds that, and then any difference between the revenue brought in on the universal sewer rate and the expenditure during the year is trued up through the sewer reserve. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, I was trying to figure out if our universal sewer charge actually fully covers the costs, or if some are slipping through and they're being absorbed by the general rate, which we would be then.
So to answer your question, the first question is yes, and the second answer is no. The general rate does not fund sewer operations or capital. So the start of last week, when I presented to you and said, oh, by the way, this budget, as I presented last week, is prepared based on flat EDU charge. With the flat EDU charge, without increasing it this year, there would have been a deficit of about $22,000 in the sewer from revenue and expenditure, and that would have been funded by a draw from the sewer reserve. When council gave direction that they were comfortable with the CPI increase to the EDU charge, that shifted to about a $22,000 surplus, which is a budgeted allocation to that reserve. So regardless of whether it is exactly covering all the expenditures during the year or not, the difference is covered through a contribution to or draw from the sewer reserve specifically.
I just like that, and I guess I'm stupid, but so what you're presenting here is a $316,000 deficit. So are we required by law to balance the budget? That's my question.
We are required to not have a deficit.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that answers my question. Okay.
Question?
Yes, Terry.
So if we were to cover that with a tax increase, what would the number be?
That would be around $0.015.
On residential?
Yeah, on just the residential, yeah. Although the commercial, like a penny on residential is about 216,000. No, I think it's 216. And a penny on commercial is like $22,000. So there's a big difference there.
Is there any appetite to increase the tax rate?
No,
Is there any-
Reduced it by 1 cent actually.
I want to own that one.
I would suggest we take a lesser portion from the transfer tax to come up with the deficit, to balance the budget.
Yeah, for this particular year.
Yeah,
Yes.
I mean, we went from 50 to 100%, I think would be
If we go to
reasonable.
84, then.
84% is reasonable.
But that doesn't lower the tax rate, I just want you to understand.
You know,
That keeps it flat.
Yeah, that would balance the budget
That would
with flat
balance
tax
the
rates.
flat tax rate.
So the same as last year,
Keeps our tax rate the same as it is. Exactly.
right? Which is a slight reduction from the year before that, but it would be the same as last year.
Reduce it by 1 cent.
Well,
I know.
We reduced it by the.
Expenditures are going away.
Last year, we reduced the residential resource rate by 1 cent, and we reduced the commercial rate by 3 cents.
Yeah.
By reducing the rate, we're still not reducing the taxes for the assessments gone.
Correct.
That's a nice one.
So I think it's got to be clear. What projects do we sort of have in the future that we're looking at that infrastructure fund for?
There's a lot of wastewater management projects for sure. Yeah.
So in the initial, so it would have been in November of '23, there was discussion around the wastewater work that's ongoing here in Chester. And there was, at that time, prepared kind of a 5-year plan for if we did all of these wastewater projects, here's how much it's likely to cost, and here's a recommendation for funding. The foundation for being able to fund that without excessive amounts of debt or increasing tax rates was to significantly increase the allocation of transfer tax.
We wanted to have some shovel-ready projects. So when the government program came out, that we had to make a quick move.
Yeah.
We would have the money to do it. That's my understanding and recollection.
Yeah.
Is that correct, Eric?
Yeah.
So if to remain the status quo tax rate, how much money, is that where we take the money out of the transfer tax? If we want to reduce it by a penny,
You would add another $216,000 to the deficit that we'd have to clear.
so if we reduced it from 84 to 75% going into infrastructure, what would that do to, what did the tax rate?
So 75% allocation would leave about $500,000 budgeted to operations. So that would cover the deficit plus about $185,000.
Which isn't quite a cent.
Right, that would be 3/4 of a cent.
We figured about
something
70% is what you need to go to do that.
Yeah, well, do the math. 2 million times 30% is 600,000. So that would be, 70% would definitely get you there.
70% would cover our expenditures and allow us to reduce the tax rate by 1 cent.
Yes.
We have the infrastructure deficit. I mean, even though we're talking about the other deficits, the reason that money is there is to deal with the infrastructure deficit. So it really is 6 from perhaps a half dozen of the other
Yeah. But we have an awful lot of projects.
in the works.
And I would say that that November report that I was referencing, the one that I actually had Aaron present for me because I had COVID at the time, that was based on a rather aggressive timeline for doing all that wastewater. That was within 5 years, having it all completed and paid for.
Yeah, and we don't even know, because it all depends on whether you get the federal funding, the provincial funding, this, that, something.
And it was all based on us paying 100% of all of it as
Yes.
well. Yeah.
Yeah.
We don't have any projects sort of identified for that accelerator fund. I mean, I know we're doing some studies and things. Is there any project particularly that accelerator fund money?
So, about $700 and some odd $1,000 of that accelerator fund are for project-based stuff. The 9 or 13 projects that we've got identified. So, e-permitting, looking at the transition area. So those the projects that are actually in the Housing Accelerator Fund, about $1.2 million of it would be available to us to do infrastructure projects. And what we had talked about previously was phase 2 of Chester Commons sewer wastewater.
Which I think is an important project.
Yeah, that's what we had, at least up until this point, was the discussion.
Well, I agree, but I spoken about this before, especially with the sewer going Chester Basin. And I just spoke casually to some of the public works staff. So we have it in Washington Shore and we have it in Chester Basin, looking at maybe a future project in Gold or what that would entail. And I think we probably did that 3 or 4 years ago. Public Works sorted it out because they, just ask them if it could be some way brought into the Chester Basin project in some way. And they said no, because you'd never be able to pump it that far. So they'd be looking at a separate system in Gold. And I think that's one of the projects, if I'm here next year, that I'm really keen to look at.
Yeah, I know, and there's a lot of unknowns, like, let's say we do expand the sewer system, which we are doing to some degree. There's a certain amount of residential growth that will come along with that, which will be increase in tax revenue, but it's really hard to project that and say in this time frame, like, it won't affect next year's budget per se, but 2-3 years out it may, There's a lot of unknowns.
Yes, so I know it's not a discussion around wastewater and wastewater strategy, But can I ask, was the Gold River project or potential for a project, was that identified? And not that it matters, because it is important. Was that identified within that document that we spent a lot of time on, paid a lot of money for, received a number of years back? Was the Gold River one?
I think what was identified, if I'm not, I don't have it in front of me anymore, but I think what was identified for the Gold River was tying, potentially doing the expansion to Western Shore and tying it into Western Shore in the future. And so they looked at both that option and potentially going to the Chester Basin side, but the more efficient and effective way to do it was to go to the.
So it's identified as an area.
It was.
That's important to that area. So I guess, just talking about wastewater and that fact that this is not a wastewater strategy discussion here, there are a good number of projects in the hopper, in the discussions from many years back and to current. And we talked about opportunities for communities in terms of expanding the capacity of where we are at now. Again, I know this isn't wastewater strategy discussion, but I have to say it. So I know even tonight, at the public meeting that we have for housing in New Ross, it may come up. Tara will be.
And New Ross is next on the list. Which is
exactly. So again, so those discussions aren't just today, they're longer term, but I appreciate your.
Yeah, and I think my issue at the time was not just for the economic benefit of wastewater, but I know that there is wastewater going into the river.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's another thing to look at.
Oh, yes.
I don't want to get into it
No,
now.
okay.
I may have another solution for that that's coming to me next week.
Okay.
Andre, and then Zoe.
Okay, so,
Everybody's talking shit, man.
so some years ago now, we decided we were gonna move de-transfer tax 50% first against some sort of reserve for future development.
Yeah.
It seemed like a good idea at the time, whatever. We convinced ourselves of it. Then times were good. We had reasonably good expenses and decent revenue, and we're like, well, why don't we just put the whole thing? Sounds good in principle. So for all of our other revenue streams, aside from de-transfer tax, we keep that, we use them to fund our operations. That's what we do. And those operations are for the benefit of all the municipality. And this particular one, we've identified de-transfer tax. We've convinced ourselves that this should be taken and allocated solely for I guess really for the expansion of sewers. Essentially, that's what it comes down to. Maybe there could be a water project someday, whatever. But it's a lot of money. That de-transfer tax at 1.8 million.
That's the estimate for the year that just ended.
Okay,
Yeah.
8 cents. 8 cents. That's a lot, isn't it?
That's about right.
Yeah, 8 cents. That would be a significant decrease in people's tax rates if we were actually not just throwing it in a pile, waiting to spend it on sewers that many people won't enjoy the benefits of. Those that are receiving the sewer expansions will benefit from it. Everybody else won't. I recognize as a government we're communal. That's part of the philosophy of government. But we also, many years ago, decided that sewer should be self-funding. In other jurisdictions, we might have organized ourselves to have a Chester Public Service Commission, and it would be its own entity that would solely do development of sewer and maintenance of sewers, and it would be separate, and it would have to be self-funded. But we were sort of sneaking the money in with this deep transfer tax deal, and it's not a little bit of money, and I think I'm admitting my own guilt here and of ignorance, because I never really thought about it in terms of the amount of tax this is. It's a lot. 8 cents? It's a big deal. It's a big deal, especially when we're talking about people's, on average, the residential tax rate increasing by 10.9 cents in the commercial, which it doesn't enjoy the benefit of a cap. Going up
9 cents or percent?
10.9%.
Percent, yeah.
Yeah. So, I don't know. I'm starting to really question the wisdom of this whole strategy of taking the D transfer tax and putting it into that pile. You know, I think we should have an open debate about that now. And that's not to say that this other everything else category, I'm quite interested in what's in there. Probably a lot of things. You know, that's 7 cents there, obviously. So we should have a quick look. But 8 cents to give away just for future sewers that pretty much everybody won't get the benefit of.
The original motion was to make it 50%.
Yes.
I don't object to perhaps rethinking that. I won't rethink the 50%. I think at least half of that has to go in to that fund. But we decided because we're doing so well, let's put the whole 100% in.
Yeah.
I don't mind backing off on that.
No, if we go to 70%, we can
Or even
cover our costs and reduce our taxes by 1 cent.
Let's do it.
I think the idea was to build up.
Of course it is, and you never know.
And we're doing that, and I like the idea of going back to 50% myself. And, well, I did like the idea of going back to 50 and reassess it in a year's time, see where we're at and what the funds are.
So you're
There's the opportunity to change the deficit, maybe reduce the tax rate a little bit, help people to pay a lot of money out and hard times for a lot of people. So I like the idea of going back to 50.
I would agree with that. That's what I was suggesting. I don't know if I did that or not, but I tried to get there.
Well, we can do that.
Okay.
Let's do that.
But I still want to look at everything else.
Yes, that's right.
I want to see what's in there.
Everything else is the rest of our operating budget, right? So
Literally everything other than what's listed there specifically.
$1.4 million, making up the $300,000 deficit from that is 20% of our operating budget. So you're looking at, to do that, you'd be looking at program and service cuts is what you'd be looking at. But that'll be part of the discussion.
Gas, please.
You know, it is every year, right? We do that every year. We go through what's in the operating
Just give us a
budget.
little more detail on that.
I just like to remind Andre that.
Okay, a little more detail on that. We're gonna only put 50% into.
Yes.
I'd just like to remind Andre that not that long ago, my esteemed colleague here was for putting wastewater on every square inch of the municipality. Do you recall my conversation?
Well,
So now you're sort of, you've rethunked your position.
I want to see the video.
Okay, all right.
Tina has a copy.
Sorry.
I do, I told you that.
And I think you remember right.
I do remember.
Okay, let's move on, because we're getting late. This is
Yeah, these
gonna be
poor kids are
well
missing
past
school.
lunchtime soon. Okay, budget correspondence, bylaws, policies. Village of Chester Intermunicipal Service Agreement. Surely that's it.
So, good afternoon.
Yes. Yes, it's not morning anymore.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah, well, last year, the Village of Chester reached out to us for helping with their maintenance activities because their maintenance person was retiring. So, we agreed to give it a go on an agreement. The only real change that they didn't like was the amount of insurance. We mentioned that earlier this year. They want to drop it from 15 to 10. So we've redone the agreement based on 10 million. And we also, we looked at the appropriate wages for our maintenance supervisor and skilled labor. So that's all covered as needed. And we recommend that it gets re-signed just for the fiscal year. It'll be a year-to-year thing because we may have years busier than others, may not be able to do it, right? But we're willing to give it a try.
Yeah, anybody have a problem with it?
I just had one question. And it's got to do with, because we've taken on this extra work, obviously. And I've had this discussion before, and I know we're getting more properties all the time, but, and public works staff is doing all they can. But we have a municipal park in Washington Shore that, I mean, the rocks are still, I get people calling me all the time, and they don't have the time to do that. You know, if you drive by there, you'll see it. And this has been a month that I've asked for it, and I know they can only do so much.
Yeah, a lot of it too is maybe on my end because the contractor made that mess, not us. So I'm after the province.
Well, I think a lot of the rocks are there from the storm, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
That washed over.
These young people are gonna go get them up for you after.
Are they? Okay, come on along, I'll take it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I just, you know, it's not a good reflection on our municipality, because it's a municipal park.
Yeah. Well, we can have another look at that. You know, the
Yeah, I
grass
appreciate
hasn't
that.
started running away yet, so you know, so we got a narrow window now.
I know,
that. So.
I know.
Andre?
I'll move that we enter into an intermunicipal service agreement with our friends at the Village of Chester.
Seconder.
Second.
Discussion. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried.
Thanks very much.
Well, I didn't know we were ever gonna make it, but Forsyth Student Council presentation.
Why don't we put them last?
Hey, they have an alternate.
They wanted to stay in here all of this.
No school.
That's right, you don't have to.
Perfect timing to talk about municipal district grants. So I prepared a few remarks, but there's a reason why we're here. We're not just here to
Skip school.
Skip school. So of course, thank you for having us. We're very pleased to be here. As you're aware, we had the pleasure to come and watch you guys perform and stuff. Talking to this side of the table over here.
Good analogy.
But we wanted to find a way to get more engaged with the municipal council because it seems at every opportunity we're being given the opportunity to engage with you guys. So we thought perhaps coming to where you do your job would be better than you coming to see where we do our job, which is not much of a job, more fun it seems. So here we are. We were given the opportunity to take the community wheels bus, and for many of us, it was our first time. So I don't know who worked the back rooms on that, but thank you, that was lovely.
Jody called me.
Jody. But to be quick, you guys give us a lot of support. You give us money when we need it. You give us a space, and you give us Jody, which is really nice.
We love Jody.
Yeah. Jody's
the best.
the real hard worker.
Just like the reverse. That's perfect.
But like I said, to bring it back, we were given a lovely district grant, which probably would be smaller if we cut the budget, but anyway. But that grant has been used so far to purchase water bottles for every incoming student to Forest Heights in every grade 9 class. A few years ago, we were given a grant to get refillable water stations at our fountains, which they're in everywhere in the school, and water bottles which have since been used and given out. So this year we made an effort to try and get water bottles again, which we have gotten water bottles, like I said, for every student, reducing plastic waste in our school and fulfilling a very important need. Of that grant that we also received, a bit of that's going towards our flagship event, the Forest Heights Amazing Race. This is our 3rd year doing it, and we're wanting to go above and beyond. Now, of course, I don't think many students at our school are looking at the Municipal Council live TV feed, simply because, so I'll tell you what's going on. It's an event where we have a bunch of tiny little stations and people move around, and we're going to go above and beyond this year with some ideas, like we're going to do an around the world theme, but anyway, but here to present the fruits of our labor, the fruits of your labor and your lovely generosity. To every municipal councillor, you will be given one of the water bottles that we have fundraised for, and here they are. As a result of your lovely generosity for your district grants.
I think you're in favor of district grants.
You know, Mr. Shafford, I appreciate that. So yeah, thank you guys so much for believing in our school. And we'll give these out to the.
Just as a comment, I believe that you're eligible for a regular grant, because years ago, we sponsored some of the outdoor space there at Forest Heights.
Oh, yeah.
And that was through the regular
Oh,
stream of
yes.
council grants.
Yes.
So you are eligible.
Yeah. Perfect. You could get even more money if you try.
We will try. But next year, this will be a different group of people sitting here, and hopefully in a few years you'll have them coming back asking for more money, for more water bottles. So thank you so much. And yeah, well,
He's giving you one, get one.
we're gonna hand these out. Just 10, so there's a few extras. So whoever would like one, you can have one here. So there's instructions inside on how to use it, how to wash them.
Thank you.
So like,
Thank you.
My wife would like me to have instructions on how to wash.
Thank you very much.
And we have a lovely box here for anyone who needs a box, because we can't take it on the bus.
Yeah, he wants it. Andre does, he'll build something there.
Can you engineer something there?
Engineer.
Yeah, he'll have to turn.
I'm the only one who's legitimately a Falcon, so I feel like the rest of you are illegitimate bottle holders.
I'll give it to one of my kids, they all went there.
Thank you again, we really do appreciate it, and
We
we certainly will
appreciate
be
you
back
being
at some point.
Thanks for your
We'll
patience.
be back out at your school.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks for making the
I don't know if we'll make it
effort.
out before the end of the year or not. No, probably not. No, we're getting very close. It was a pleasure to have this with us.
Thank you for having us.
Sharon, is your,
Put it off the
next week? So we have no further business, a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.